For more on the report, its findings and what it means for accountability, government and human rights in Zimbabwe, we're joined on the line by Idriss Ali Nassah, who is a senior Africa researcher at Human Rights Watch. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time and welcome.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
I mean, as we try and get a better understanding on what is at stake here, perhaps let's start here. What prompted Human Rights Watch to publish this, the recommendations at this time, especially considering what is essentially at stake?
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, this been maybe the fourth time that Human Rights Watch has followed up on this particular matter. We have published on this case before. For purpose of the viewers at home, what happened in 2018 is that armed forces in Zimbabwe went on the streets, confronted protesters who were unarmed, shot at them, and killed six unarmed protesters, and also injured 35 people. So this happened 8 years ago, and since then, we as Human Rights Watch, we've been calling consistently for elements of accountability, to ensure that the authorities hold those, that perpetrated these grave human rights abuses to account. And this has not happened. And, the report that we just put out, the statement that we just put out a few days ago actually is yet another reminder of, the unfulfilled promises made by the authorities when this happened, that those that took part in these abuses were going to be held to account, and 8 years down the line, that has not happened. So we consistently remind authorities in Zimbabwe and everybody else that the violations that happened 8 years ago to date have not been accounted for.
Your report says Zimbabwe has entrenched a culture of impunity, which is quite a strong accusation. In trying to get an understanding, how has this manifested in Zimbabwe since the 2018 post-election violence, and what evidence has led to such a conclusion?
Well, I mean, Zimbabwe has a long and troubling history of impunity, especially around electoral periods. Even outside of electoral periods, you have a litany of abuses carried out, especially state security forces and those aligned to the ruling ZANU-PF party, the militia, and others. So the history and culture of impunity in Zimbabwe is a thread that runs from probably the time of independence, with very little accountability for that. And if you look at recent times, since this happened 8 years ago, we've consistently, as Human Rights Watch and other organizations, called out against the grave human rights abuses that are happening in Zimbabwe. Not too long after the 2018, violence that happened against innocent people, in 2019, we saw another episode of state violence against innocent protesters. 17 people were killed in that episode as well.
And when abuses go unpunished, I mean, what kind of message do you think that sends to citizens, law enforcement, and perhaps political leaders?
I mean, well, to citizens, it disempowers citizens, the innocent victims of these abuses. And then it empowers and emboldens the perpetrators. Because if you look at the case of Zimbabwe, for example, if you look at the grave human rights abuses that happened during the 2008 elections, where hundreds of opposition supporters were slaughtered and killed and displaced, no one was held to account. And the same players that perpetrated these violations in the 2008 elections were back at play again, in subsequent elections. So for the ruling party, they actually harvest from this culture of fear, impunity, fear in the citizenry, and impunity, that accompanies those that act in the name of the state or those that act in the name of the ruling ZANU-PF party. So it is disempowering. And that cycle has to be broken. There has to be change in Zimbabwe in terms of institutions coming to, the help of people that are, whose rights are violated in the manner that we've seen over time.
And just getting an understanding of the bigger picture and, when we talk about accountability, has the Zimbabwean government made any measurable progress at all in addressing some of the Commission's recommendations?
I mean, after the 2018, violence, there was a commission of inquiry that was instituted, which was led by the former president of South Africa, Kgalema Motlanthe.
Mm-hmm.
And this commission had clear recommendations. First of all, it established the fact that the 6 people and the 35 were killed and injured at the hands of the state security forces, particularly the army and the anti-riot police. And they had specific recommendations, including compensation for those injured, including holding perpetrators accountable. And that's very key. Since then, no one of the security forces has been arrested. No one has been prosecuted for these violations, and no compensation has been paid to any of those people that suffered loss of property or those that were injured.
Mm-mm. In fact, if you'll allow me just to expand the conversation, I'm going to ask Zimbabwean human rights lawyer Doug Coltart to join the conversation. A very good evening to you, Doug. Thank you for your time. And just listening to some of the highlights, of course, in expanding the conversation and really calling for accountability. I know that you've represented victims and watched these events unfold firsthand. How would you describe the impact as we try and get a better understanding? Because what Idriss is speaking about here is essentially the tail end, if you were just joining, the Motlanthe Commission having identified members of the security forces as responsible for the deaths of civilians. Perhaps talk to us about your input.
Yes, it's the impact of the failure to implement those recommendations of the Motlanthe Commission has been devastating on the families of the victims. So I represented the widower of Sylvia Maposa, who died a few years ago, a broken man, having never received compensation from the state for the loss of his wife, who was the breadwinner, having never seen any progress made in the investigations into her death, being denied access to the post-mortem for his wife. And when we made repeated follow-ups with the police about the investigations, there was just stonewalling and a complete black box in terms of information about what was going on, and this, as I understand it, is the case for all of the other victims. There really has been nothing for them. The Motlanthe Commission really appeared to be a kind of a checkbox to say, oh look, we've done something about this, but with absolutely no follow through.
Idriss, as we listen to Doug talking about how the Motlanthe Commission was essentially a checkbox to say something has been done, why has there been so little accountability?
Because ZANU-PF, the ruling party, over time has harvested from that, really, the very fact that its members can go out, violate people's rights, intimidate people, close civil and political space. Even the authorities themselves. If you look at what has been happening recently in Zimbabwe, opposition activists, human rights defenders, journalists are arrested arbitrarily, detained in prolonged pre-trial detention, have their rights violated. So it's actually almost a tactic of subjugating and bludgeoning the people of Zimbabwe into submission by taking away their core human rights.
And with that, Doug, having read Human Rights Watch's findings, what resonates most with your own experience on the ground as you talk about the impact? I mean, you speak about the Maposa family dying, a broken man, never ever receiving compensation or any sense of accountability.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really resonates as I look through that Human Rights Watch report is this culture of impunity. And we see this time and again, not just with the 1st of August 2018 victims, but with the victims of many, many other human rights violations that have been perpetrated in Zimbabwe over many, many years. That there is this a culture of impunity, where even when the courts award compensation to victims of torture, it's then incredibly difficult to actually get the state to pay that compensation. There is almost never any individual accountability for the actual government officials, police officers, soldiers who are involved in sometimes horrendous atrocities, and that is what creates this culture of impunity that Human Rights Watch talks about, where it continues again and again and again, and it is essentially, it has become part of the architecture of how a regime manages to retain a stranglehold on power, not through democratic legitimacy, but through fear and coercion. And so that is always in the back of people's minds when they think of of speaking out, or of engaging their right to peaceful protest, etc. That is in the back of people's minds. That not only will these, this kind of brutality be weaponized against me, but there won't be any accountability for those behind it.
In fact, perhaps as Idriss, we wrap up our conversation and keep Doug on the line. If President Emmerson Mnangagwa's government were to implement just 3 of the recommendations tomorrow, which do you believe would make the biggest impact?
Holding the perpetrators accountable, identifying, who did what in the killings, and holding them, to individual accounts, and the state to compensate, those that lost, loved ones, those that were injured, those that lost property. So there has to be a system. Zimbabweans have to start to believe yet again that people can be held to account for their egregious human rights violations. That the rule of law can be established and respected in the country, and then there has to be an end to the weaponization of violence against innocent people, that people should feel free, Zimbabweans should feel free to engage in political discourse. If they so need to even protest and petition their government in a free and democratic manner, until such a time that institutions, rule of law is established, that people are held to account for their human rights abuses and violations. Zimbabweans will still live under this shadow of fear, intimidation, threats of violence, and subjugation of their civil and political rights.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for giving us your insight, Idriss Ali Nassah, who's Senior Africa Research at Human Rights Watch. Now, Doug, as we continue the conversation, Idriss touched on fear. You also spoke about the impact of fear. Do ordinary Zimbabweans still fear the consequences, as we speak, of speaking out, attending protest, or openly supporting opposition parties? How entrenched is the idea of fear?
The fear is very pervasive, and we have seen this play out just over the last few days, and even today there were reports of men who came to the home of Jacob Ngarivume, the spokesperson of one of the coalitions, or the main coalition that has been pushing back against the constitutional amendments, which is the kind of the latest attempt by the system to decimate our democracy and entrench the ruling party. These men came and delivered a death threat to Jacob Ngarivume at his home, saying that we're going to kill you and you'll die for nothing. So this type of intimidation happens all the time. We saw it just recently on the 31st of July, where there were calls for protests.
Yeah.
And the police intimidated some of the organizers who had written to the police to request permission to hold a peaceful protest, intimidated them, saying you will be held personally liable if anything happens on the day, to the point where at least one of the organizers ended up being so fearful that they ended up withdrawing their letter or seeking a postponement. So fear is deeply pervasive.
Yeah.
It cuts across all parts of society, and I think this is something that I really feel is one of the key things that needs to change in order for freedom to come to Zimbabwe, is for Zimbabweans to essentially throw off the shackles of fear and realize that fear is essentially holding us back from exercising our rights and being able to bring the transformation to our society that will create a society where we don't need to fear, but you have to push through that. And I think courage is not the absence of fear, but it's the willingness to take action despite the fear.
Absolutely.
So we do need to get to that point.
In the midst of this, there's an entire generation of young people, young Zimbabweans who are teenagers or even children looking back to 2018. What impact has this legacy of unresolved violence, so to speak, had on them?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it comes up in conversation all the time. There was this very vivid visual which of the kneeling soldier just kneeling down and firing into the crowd, and that I think has been seared into the minds of people in Zimbabwe, and people mention it all the time. If someone speaks about engaging in attending a march, people talk about that moment. It has become a kind of a part of the kind of national consciousness that we live in a society where if at least people feel or believe that if we march, we won't just be beaten by the police, but that they may actually open fire on us with live bullets. And I think that really kind of raises the stakes for a lot of people. The reality is that there were actually protests after the 1st of August 2018, peaceful protests which were successfully conducted without any incident. So that is something that we sometimes forget, that in November of 2018 there were peaceful protests, there were peaceful gatherings in Africa Unity Square. The government forgets that, but also civil society forgets that as well. It was really COVID where a peaceful protest was criminalized, and it's since COVID that we've never really recovered our right in terms of Section 59 of the Zimbabwe Constitution. There has never been an authorized protest, to my knowledge, since COVID. We essentially, that aspect of our constitution has been suspended, which is a tragedy and a terrible violation of our constitution.
Yeah, Doug, if you this evening had the attention of Zimbabwe's leadership tonight, what one decision do you think you would urge them to immediately take in order to begin rebuilding trust?
Yeah, well, I think the points that Idriss raised are absolutely fundamental. That there has to be both accountability and compensation for past violations. And then I think there would need to be a real reassurance that Zimbabweans' rights will be respected and protected and fulfilled, that people can exercise their rights freely without being violated, which the state never does. Whenever there are calls for peaceful protest, we had these horrific scenes last week where every single province, a minister came with a soldier on one side and a police officer on the other side and said, basically, if you try to exercise your rights, we will deal with you. So that type of language needs to stop. And then I think there really needs to be a call for open, broad national dialogue to say, how do we get out of the mess that we are in? How do we deal with the crisis of governance that we are in? How do we deal with the crisis of legitimacy, where we now have a government in place that has completely violated its own constitution, run roughshod over the provisions of the constitution, which required a referendum, for these amendments to be put through, creating this terrible crisis of legitimacy. How do we come together as a nation and try to resolve our problems? Because this nation is a nation for all of us. And so that is what I would urge the state to do, if there really is political will to get Zimbabwe out of the quagmire that it's in.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing that with us. Doug Coltart, a Zimbabwean human rights lawyer, just speaking to some of the challenges and, of course, solutions as the assessment of some of the recommendations on the back of post-election violence in 2018 come to the forefront. Human Rights Watch's report raising some serious loopholes.